What if the future doesn't arrive like a thunderclap, but like a quiet echo, already hiding in words someone wrote long ago? Imagine a hand moving across papyrus by lamplight, a monk in a stone room, a captive scholar counting on his fingers in exile, a priest tracing a calendar wheel that turns and turns and turns again. None of them know our world. None of them can picture satellites, skyscrapers, or the glow of a phone screen. And yet, across centuries, we keep stumbling into sentences that feel oddly, uncomfortably specific. Not because they promise miracles, because they sound like people trying to map uncertainty with the only tools they had: memory, math, myth, and pattern. They looked at empires rising and ports swelling with wealth. They watched seasons repeat and stars circle back to familiar positions. They listened to the way human ambition makes the same mistakes in new costumes. Then they wrote, sometimes in poetry, sometimes in hard clauses, like a contract meant for time itself. Most prophecy stories dissolve under a clear light. We remember the hits and forget the misses. We bend metaphors until they fit the shape of what already happened. It's the oldest trick in the book, and it explains a lot. But not everything. Every so often you find a detail that refuses to behave, a name that appears too early, a sequence that unfolds in the wrong order to be convenient, a prediction that doesn't just gesture toward ruin, but describes the method: stone, sea, ash, a narrow strait, a road built from rubble. And then you discover the road is still there. This is not a hunt for proof. It's a journey into the human need to see beyond the next hill. Because whether prophecy is insight, coincidence, or something stranger, it reveals the same truth. We are creatures who cannot stop listening for footsteps in the dark and wondering whose they are. What if the first prophecy wasn't a vision at all, but an invoice written in advance? Picture a port city at dawn. The sea is calm, but the docks are already awake. Ropes creak. Timber knocks against hulls. Traders speak in quick, practiced phrases, their hands stained with salt and ink. In places like this, the future is not a mystery. It's a calculation. Along the eastern Mediterranean, ancient seers sometimes sounded less like mystics and more like economists. They watched the flow of ships and the mood of kings. They knew that power loves predictability, and that wealth, when it gathers too tightly in one place, becomes a beacon. In the old stories, a wealthy island city rises like a jewel set in the sea. Its merchants are admired, envied, and quietly resented. It buys safety with silver. It builds walls. It laughs at threats from the mainland. And then, in a set of lines that reads like a slow tightening of a net, the prophecy describes what comes next: siege, stripping, scattering. Not just destruction, but dismantling. Stone pulled from stone, dust pushed into water, a city not merely defeated, but erased down to its bones. For centuries, those words lived as metaphor until archaeology began to read the shoreline like a diary. Beneath modern streets and shallow waves, the evidence looked less like poetic exaggeration and more like method. Layers of burning, abrupt abandonment. Rubble used to build new causeways, the kind of practical recycling conquerors do when they're tired of being challenged by the same fortress. It's tempting to call this simple pattern recognition. Ports rise, empires covet, violence follows. But the lingering unease comes from the specificity, the sense that the writer wasn't guessing at some day, but describing a particular kind of ending. And it raises a question that stays with us long after the waves quiet down. When someone predicts the fall of a city, are they seeing the future, or just seeing us. Because human nature has its own prophecy built in. What we build to protect ourselves can also teach others exactly how to break us. What if a prophecy can't be understood until it has a face? On a cold morning in an old European city, the air smells of river water and coal smoke. Bells mark the hour. A crowd gathers where cobblestones meet a public square. History often looks grand from a distance, but up close, it's personal. Names whispered, doors bolted, letters burned before anyone can read them. Some predictions don't speak in symbols. They speak in people. There are writings from centuries ago that seem to sketch a procession of rulers, figures described by quirks, titles, or traits that feel too pointed to be purely decorative. The language is slippery, as if the author expects censorship or expects time to be the censor. A lion here, a youth crowned too soon there, a man from the islands who arrives like weather, inevitable, impossible to argue with. Most of it can be shrugged off as clever storytelling. Anyone can write riddles and let future generations do the fitting. But every so often, you encounter a line that lands with a thud, a detail that matches not the broad idea of a ruler, but the strange geometry of a particular life, how someone rose, where they fell, the manner of their exile, the shape of their return. It's not that the prophecy is perfect, it's that it occasionally feels like it's looking over the shoulder of time, and the temptation begins to treat history like a script already written. Yet there's another way to read it, not as fate, but as a mirror, because power leaves patterns as recognizable as fingerprints. Ambition tends to repeat the same gestures, the urgent speech, the promise of renewal, the tightening of control, the softening of truth into something useful. When you watch enough rulers, you start to predict them the way sailors predict storms. So maybe the prophet didn't see one specific leader. Maybe they saw the shape of leadership itself, the recurring silhouette of someone who believes they can outrun consequence. Still, it's hard to shake the feeling that these old texts are not only describing events, but describing how it feels when the world tilts, how a society senses, before it has evidence, that something is coming. The way people become superstitious when their nervous system is smarter than their politics. And that may be prophecy's truest power, not forecasting the future, but revealing how fragile our certainty is, how quickly a single human life, placed in the right moment, can make tomorrow feel predetermined. What if the most accurate prophecies come from people who understand not visions, but systems? Picture a night sky so clear it feels sharpened. Somewhere on a high plateau, far from city lamps, a figure leans over an instrument, wood, brass, stone, carefully aligned with the heavens. The stars don't speak, but they repeat. And repetition, for a patient mind, can sound like language. Ancient calendars weren't just about dates. They were attempts to tame uncertainty, when to plant, when to travel, when to expect floods, when to fear drought. In some cultures, time wasn't a straight line. It was a wheel. And if the wheel turned long enough, the future wasn't mysterious. It was familiar. There are old predictions built around cycles, a certain number of moons, a certain count of years, a certain return of planets to the same positions. These texts don't announce this will happen the way a fortune teller might. They suggest, when the pattern returns, so will the consequence. Sometimes, centuries later, we look back and realize the pattern did return. A famine, a plague, a war that rose like a storm from a particular direction, or an ecological shift that lined up with records of earlier disruptions. Not because the stars caused it, necessarily, but because the stars helped people keep track of long rhythms in climate, agriculture, and human behavior. To modern ears, it sounds like mysticism dressed as math. But to a world without satellite data and global networks, it was a kind of science. Careful observation paired with story so the knowledge would survive. Myths were memory devices. Prophecy was a way of packaging warning. The surprising part is not that some predictions came true. It's that any of them survived at all, copied by hand, carried through war, translated, altered. What if the clearest warnings are the ones we refuse to hear until the ground itself speaks? Imagine a mountain at rest. Its slopes are green. Villagers sit in its shadow the way children sit near a sleeping animal, close enough to feel comfort, far enough to forget danger. Smoke rises from chimneys. Bread cools on windowsills. Life becomes ordinary beside the extraordinary. Then, in older texts, sometimes carved, sometimes sung, there's a line about fire under stone, a note about a dark noon, a warning that the air will turn thick, that birds will fall silent, that people will flee not from an enemy, but from their own horizon. It's easy to call that poetic imagination. People have always feared the earth. They've always told stories about mountains that burn and seas that swallow. What else do you do when you live on a planet that can change its mind? But history has a way of making metaphors look literal. When a volcano erupts, it doesn't just reshape land, it rewrites memory. Ash preserves footprints like a photograph. A city becomes a time capsule. And the details of disaster, how it begins, how it spreads, how it ends, often resemble the old warnings with unsettling precision. Not because the writer witnessed the exact event, but because humans, living near risk, notice the signs that repeat. Tremors, strange smells, animals behaving wrong, wells turning bitter. In that sense, prophecy can be a kind of inheritance. A community passes down the shape of danger the way it passes down recipes. Not everyone believes it. Not everyone needs to. The story just has to survive long enough to be useful. Still, there's a haunting element in these accounts, the way they capture the emotional texture of catastrophe. The sudden realization that the world you trusted has been borrowing stability from a deeper force. The moment you look at your familiar street and understand it might not exist tomorrow. And when you read these warnings after the fact, they feel less like predictions and more like grief written early, a letter sent across time by someone who knew that the worst part of disaster isn't the fire or the falling stone. It's the disbelief. We build homes in dangerous places because the danger is quiet most days. We make peace with risk because we must. And then we act surprised when the earth reminds us what it is. So maybe the question isn't whether ancient people foretold a specific eruption. Maybe the question is why we keep needing prophecy at all, why we require a story, a sign, a dramatic voice, before we take seriously the plain reality that everything solid is, in the end, temporary. What if the prophecy wasn't about the sky, but about what we would do once we could touch it? Picture a workshop filled with metal filings and the smell of oil. A small room where a person works with obsessive patience, assembling pieces that seem too delicate to matter. Springs, gears, lenses, the kind of objects that, at first, feel like toys, until one day they change the way a civilization sees itself. Some old writings speak of eyes that will move beyond the limits of flesh. They describe a time when humans will watch the world from above, when messages will travel faster than horses, when distant places will feel suddenly close. In their original context, these lines might have meant angels or gods, or they might have meant nothing more than metaphor. But then you look at the last 2 centuries, telegraph wires, radio towers, satellites, and the metaphor takes on a new weight. We have made eyes that don't blink. We have built voices that cross oceans without lungs. We have created a second sky, not made of clouds, but of machines circling in silence. And it changes everything. Not just how we communicate, but how we think about distance, privacy, and consequence. The moment you can see a storm forming on the other side of the planet, you can no longer pretend you didn't know. The moment you can watch cities glow at night from orbit, you can no longer claim ignorance of how crowded the world has become. If a prophecy hinted at this, maybe it wasn't magic. Maybe it was the simplest human instinct, to extend ourselves, to reach farther, to know more, to refuse the boundary of our senses. But with every extension comes a new vulnerability. The same networks that connect us can overwhelm us. The same eyes that help us understand can also surveil. The same speed that saves lives can also spread panic. We don't just build tools, we build environments that reshape the meaning of being human. So the question grows quieter and sharper. If ancient writers imagined a world where the sky became a pathway, were they celebrating us or warning us? Because there's a strange irony in modern prophecy. We don't need seers to predict the future we're engineering. We publish it in press releases. We announce it in product launches. We promise it in optimistic language that sounds, sometimes, like scripture. And yet we still seem surprised by what arrives. Maybe prophecy persists because it's not really about what's coming. It's about how we feel when it comes, when the future finally appears, not as a dream, but as a mirror, showing us what we value, what we fear, and what we're willing to trade for the illusion of control. What if the prophecy wasn't about a single disaster, but about the quiet chain reaction that disaster leaves behind? Imagine a coastline after a great wave, not the wave itself, the aftermath. Boats stranded in streets, salt crusting on window frames, a child's shoe half buried in sand where a living room used to be. The sea has returned to its normal posture, almost polite. But nothing else is normal. In old records, you sometimes find warnings about water that arrives without rain, about a wall of the ocean that moves like an animal, about towns swallowed in minutes. These accounts can read like myth until you stand in a place where the earth has actually done it, and you realize the language is simply trying to keep up. But what lingers in those writings isn't just the image of the wave, it's what follows. The hunger, the sickness, the migration, the sudden collapse of trust, when people who once relied on the same market and temple now compete for clean drinking water, because catastrophe doesn't end when the ground stops shaking or the water recedes. It keeps traveling, disguised as ripple effects. Crops fail, trade routes break, families scatter, governments strain, rumors become currency, and in that fragile space, human nature becomes more visible, our capacity for generosity and our talent for turning fear into cruelty. This is where prophecy becomes less about prediction and more about moral memory. A community remembers that when the sea takes the docks, the real danger may come later, when the pantry is empty, when the first winter arrives, when people start asking who should have warned them and why no one did. Modern science explains these events with breathtaking clarity. Tectonic plates, subduction zones, pressure, release. We can model waves, map risk, send alerts, and still we build cities close to water because water is where life gathers. We trade safety for beauty, for work, for belonging. So when an old text seems to forecast a great flood or a swallowed city, it can feel eerie. But maybe the deeper accuracy lies elsewhere. Maybe it's in the understanding that disaster is never only natural. It becomes social the moment it touches us. And that raises a difficult question. If we can now see danger coming, if we have the instruments, the satellites, the warnings, what does it mean when we still suffer as though we were unprepared? Perhaps the point of prophecy is not to prove that someone long ago knew what would happen. Perhaps it is to remind us that knowledge is not the same as readiness, and that survival is not only about predicting the wave, but about deciding ahead of time what kind of people we intend to be when it arrives. What if the prophecy was never written for the moment of collapse, but for the moment after, when people try to rebuild meaning? Picture a library, not the romantic kind with chandeliers and polished wood, but a room crowded with shelves, each one packed tight, dust in the air, fingers moving along spines, a historian searching for a thread that didn't break. There are old predictions that speak of knowledge vanishing, of scrolls burned, teachers silenced, languages forgotten. They describe an age when the lamps go out, when learning becomes dangerous, when the best minds hide their work inside allegory, as if truth has to dress in costume to survive. We know those ages, not as one singular darkness, but as many smaller ones scattered across time. Wars that turned universities into rubble, purges that turned scholars into prisoners, fires that turned archives into ash. The loss is often invisible to the rest of society until years later, when people realize they no longer know what they once knew. And then, sometimes, the prophecy turns. It speaks of rediscovery, a buried book found under a floor, a forgotten city uncovered by accident, a translation that opens like a door, letting old ideas breathe again. This is where the coming true part becomes complicated, because the return of knowledge is not a miracle, it's a human act. Someone chooses to dig, someone chooses to preserve, someone decides that a dusty manuscript matters more than the immediate comfort of ignoring it. In that sense, prophecy can function like a time capsule of hope, a reminder that loss is not always permanent and that the future may recover what the present discards. But there's also a warning in it, because rediscovery doesn't always lead to wisdom. Sometimes the return of knowledge is used to dominate. Sometimes it becomes a weapon, stripped of context, sharpened for profit or power. We don't just resurrect ideas, we reshape them. So when ancient texts seem to predict cycles of forgetting and remembering, they may be describing a fundamental rhythm of civilization, growth, arrogance, rupture, rebuilding, the fragile dance between curiosity and fear. And the question that hangs in the quiet of that library is simple, almost tender. What knowledge are we losing right now without noticing? Not just data, not just books, but the slow skills, patience, attention, craft, the ability to sit with uncertainty without demanding an immediate answer. If prophecy has any use in a modern age, perhaps it's this: to make us ask what we want to carry forward before history decides for us. What if the most unsettling prophecies aren't about events, but about how we change once we can no longer tell what is real? Picture a photograph left in the sun. At first, it's crisp, faces clear, edges sharp. Then slowly, the image fades, not all at once. One corner washes out, a shadow loses depth. The details soften until the picture becomes less a record and more a suggestion. In older writings, there are warnings about false signs, about voices that sound convincing but carry no body, about images that persuade more than they inform. In their time, that might have meant omens, charlatans, theater, or it might have meant something deeper, the fear that perception itself can be manipulated. Today, we live inside that fear. A video can be altered. A quote can be clipped into a new meaning. A familiar face can be made to say words they never said. We can manufacture memory at scale, not just by lying, but by producing evidence that looks like truth. The ancient idea of illusion has become an industry. This is where prophecy strangely feels modern. Not because someone predicted algorithms, but because someone understood the human weakness that makes them powerful. Our desire for certainty, our hunger for narrative, our tendency to trust what feels coherent over what is complicated. When the world becomes confusing, we reach for stories that simplify. We choose what confirms our fears. We share what makes us feel informed, even if it's only making us feel. And then the line between truth and comfort blurs until we can't tell which one we're defending. The revelation isn't that deception exists. It always has. The revelation is that our tools now let deception travel faster than correction. A rumor can outrun a retraction. An image can brand itself into the mind before doubt has time to form. The future arrives in fragments, and we stitch it together from whatever is loudest. So when you read an old warning about lying wonders, it can feel less like superstition and more like psychology, a reminder that perception is not a perfect window. It's a negotiable space shaped by emotion, by repetition, by trust. And that leads to a quiet question that feels heavier than any prediction of fire or flood. What happens to a society when shared reality dissolves? Not in a dramatic collapse, but in small, daily choices. When we stop asking for evidence, stop admitting uncertainty, stop practicing the slow discipline of changing our minds. If prophecy has a moral, it may be this: the future is not only something that happens to us, it's something we agree on together. And when that agreement frays, the most dangerous loss isn't facts. It's the ability to recognize one another as fellow witnesses to the same world. What if the prophecy was never about the end of the world, but about the end of our illusion that the world will always be stable? Imagine a city at night seen from far above. Streets form a glowing grid. Bridges stitch dark water to dark land. The light looks permanent from a distance, like a constellation that can't be disturbed. But up close, every bright window belongs to someone who locks their door and hopes tomorrow will resemble today. Some ancient predictions speak of a time when the ground of nations shifts, when borders blur, when people move in great tides not because they want adventure, but because home becomes unlivable. They describe unrest not as a single battle, but as a slow unthreading. Food becoming scarce, trust becoming brittle, leaders losing legitimacy, neighbors turning cautious. This kind of prophecy is almost boring in its realism. It doesn't require miracles. It requires only pressure applied long enough. In our era, we've learned new words for old processes: climate displacement, supply chain collapse, pandemic shock, economic contagion. We map these forces with graphs and models. But the lived experience is still ancient. Uncertainty in the stomach, rumor in the marketplace, fear in the eyes of parents who can't promise safety. The eerie part is how often these old warnings understand the sequence. First, people deny the change. Then, they argue about its meaning. Then they blame one another. Then, they adapt, sometimes with cooperation, sometimes with violence, sometimes with quiet resilience that never makes headlines. Prophecy, read this way, is not fortune-telling. It's a portrait of social stress, a reminder that civilizations are not just built from stone, but from shared agreements about fairness, about identity, about what is owed to whom. When those agreements weaken, the buildings may still stand, but the city feels haunted. And here's the human insight that arrives like a soft footstep. We often mistake complexity for permanence. We see systems working and assume they will keep working. We forget that stability is not a default setting. It is maintenance. So when an old text warns of upheaval, the question isn't whether the writer saw our specific crises. The question is whether they saw the underlying truth, that human societies are fragile precisely because they are human, because they rely on trust. And trust can be exhausted. The open question at the end of this chapter is simple and uncomfortable. If the future is shaped by pressures we can already measure, why do we treat preparation as optional? Maybe the real prophecy is the one written into every generation, that sooner or later we will be asked to choose between short-term comfort and long-term care, and we will discover, in that moment, who we truly are. What if the prophecy wasn't hidden in fire or thunder, but in a simple sentence about how the body fails? Picture a crowded room with the windows shut. Summer heat presses in. Someone coughs once, then again, and people glance up with the small irritation we reserve for interruptions. A few days later, the cough is everywhere. A week later, the room feels like a memory of itself. Long before microscopes and lab coats, people recognize the pattern of sickness. It travels, it clusters, it changes the mood of a city faster than any speech. Old writings sometimes speak of breath turned dangerous, of invisible arrows, of marketplaces that go quiet, of doors marked and streets emptied. In their era, these were not metaphors. They were survival notes written in the language of dread. When modern pandemics arrive, we reach for new explanations, and we should. We track pathogens, build vaccines, model spread. But the human experience is ancient. The loneliness, the suspicion, the grief conducted through distance. The strange feeling of being a threat to the people you love simply by standing too close. If prophecy seems to predict these events, it may be because disease is one of humanity's oldest companions. It returns in new disguises, but the arc is familiar. Denial becomes debate. Debate becomes fear. Fear becomes blame. And somewhere inside the chaos, ordinary people do extraordinary things. Nurses showing up, neighbors leaving food, scientists working through the night, families learning new rituals of care. The revelation here is not that someone foresaw a specific virus. It's that they understood how sickness reveals a society's values, who is protected first, who is left behind, how much we will sacrifice for one another when the threat is shared but uneven. And there's a second layer, quieter and harder to admit. Epidemics expose the limits of control. We build cities and schedules, we plan careers and vacations, we assume we are steering. Then a microscopic strand of biology rearranges everything, and we remember how much of life is negotiation with forces we can't see. So perhaps the point of these old warnings is not prediction, but humility, a reminder that progress does not make us invulnerable. It makes us interconnected, and interconnectedness is both strength and risk. As this chapter closes, the question lingers like a breath in cold air. If our lives can be overturned by what we cannot see, what does it mean to live well? Maybe it means investing less in the fantasy of certainty and more in the practice of compassion. Because when the invisible arrives, compassion is the only protection that scales. What if the prophecy was never about inventing the future, but about remembering what it costs? Imagine a small town where the night is truly dark. No hum of highways, no bright signs, just porch lights and the soft chorus of insects. In that darkness, you can feel how recent electricity is, how modern the idea of constant illumination really is. Some old predictions speak of a second sun made by human hands, a light so intense it turns night into day, a fire that arrives not from the sky, but from within our own making. In ancient language, it reads like myth. In modern ears, it sounds like a warning that suddenly has a shadow. Because we did build a second sun. We split what was once considered indivisible. We learned to release energy from the heart of matter. And in the brightest moment of that achievement, we discovered that knowledge can arrive paired with terror. The light that proves our genius can also reveal our capacity for self-destruction. Yet even here, prophecy can be misunderstood. It's tempting to treat these old lines as proof that someone knew about modern weapons. But what if they were describing something broader? The moment when human power outgrows human maturity. Every era has its version of this imbalance. A new tool appears. Society rushes to use it. Ethics follows behind, like an exhausted parent trying to catch up. The tension is not between science and superstition. It's between capability and wisdom. The most haunting aspect of second sun imagery is that it captures both awe and grief at once. It suggests a civilization standing at a threshold, holding a torch that can light the way or burn the house down. And it asks, without saying it directly, whether we can be trusted with our own brilliance. In the modern world, this question doesn't belong only to physics. It belongs to biology, to computing, to every technology that amplifies human reach. Because the core issue is the same. Can our empathy expand as fast as our power? As this chapter ends, the reflection is less about apocalypse and more about responsibility. The future is shaped not only by what we discover, but by what we choose to do with the discovery. And choice is the one thing prophecy cannot force on us. So here is the open question, set gently on the table like a fragile object. If we are capable of creating a second sun, are we also capable of creating the restraint, the cooperation, and the care required to live under its light without turning it into our last sunrise? What if the final prophecy is not about what happens to the world, but about what happens to the story we tell ourselves about the world? Picture an old person at a kitchen table, turning a coin between thumb and forefinger. The light is soft. The house is quiet. They are not thinking about empires or inventions. They are thinking about a single choice they made decades ago and how it rippled outward, touching lives they will never meet. This is where prophecy becomes intimate. Ancient texts often end not with fireworks, but with a turning inward. After the cities fall and the seas rise and the skies fill with strange new lights, the message narrows to the human scale. It asks what kind of hearts we become in the face of uncertainty. Whether we learn, whether we harden, whether we remember what matters when everything else changes. In the modern era, we're surrounded by predictions, forecasts, models, warnings. They arrive in dashboards and headlines, in polished presentations and urgent speeches. We live inside a constant future tense. And yet, the most important questions remain stubbornly ancient. Not what will happen, but who will we be when it happens? Because the future isn't only a collection of events, it's a moral landscape. It's shaped by patience or impatience, by generosity or hoarding, by the quiet decisions made in ordinary rooms. If prophecy feels compelling, it may be because it gives structure to fear. It promises that chaos has meaning. It suggests that history is legible, that time is not random, that someone, somewhere, understood the pattern. But there's danger in that comfort. When we believe the future is written, we become spectators to our own lives. We stop taking responsibility. We wait for fate, or we fight ghosts. We mistake inevitability for truth. The wiser reading is gentler. Prophecy, at its best, is not a verdict. It is an invitation. It asks us to pay attention to ourselves, to one another, to the world that holds us. It reminds us that the most reliable predictions are the ones rooted in human behavior, what we repeat, what we avoid, what we refuse to learn. So as we approach the end of this journey, the last chapter does not offer certainty. It offers a mirror, and the open question it leaves us with is almost quiet enough to miss. If the future is shaped by stories, which story are we choosing to live in it? The one where we are powerless, waiting for a script to unfold, or the one where we are imperfect, fragile, and still capable, through small acts of truth and care, of changing what comes next? What if the real prophecy is not a message from the past, but a question the past keeps asking us? Imagine standing in a museum after closing hours. The lights are dimmed. Glass cases hold objects that once belonged to living hands. A chipped bowl, a worn tool, a page of careful handwriting. Each artifact is proof that someone was here, doing ordinary things, eating, building, loving, while history gathered around them like weather. We tend to think of prophecy as a spotlight aimed forward, but maybe it's also a lantern aimed backward, showing how much of human life repeats. Empires rise with confidence, then crack under their own weight. Cities thrive on trade, then fall to envy and force. Knowledge blooms, then burns, then returns. New tools expand our reach, and with them, our capacity to harm. Disasters arrive, and we discover again who we are under pressure. When old predictions seem to come true, it's tempting to feel awe or fear, as if time itself is scripted. Yet the deeper pattern may be simpler. People long ago were paying attention to the same human materials we are made of now. Ambition, grief, pride, tenderness, denial, courage. They wrote what they saw in the language available to them. Symbol, poetry, warning, prayer. And we, reading those words today, bring our own hunger to them. We want reassurance that chaos has meaning. We want proof that someone understands what is happening. We want to believe the future can be known, because knowing feels safer than not knowing. But the most humanistic insight may be this: prophecy matters less as prediction and more as practice. A practice of noticing, of remembering, of holding complexity without surrendering to despair, of admitting that the future is not a single road, but a field of choices shaped by billions of small actions. If there is any lesson worth carrying forward, it's that interpretation is a responsibility. We can use ancient warnings as fuel for panic or as prompts for sue. We can treat them as entertainment or as reminders to protect what is precious: truth, empathy, shared reality, the slow work of community. So we end where we began, with a quiet question, not a claim. What if the future doesn't arrive like a thunderclap, but like an echo? And if it is an echo, then our task is not to fear the voice in the dark. Our task is to decide what we want the voice to be. Because one day, someone will stand over the artifacts we leave behind, our words, our tools, our choices, and they will read them as a message, not to prove what we knew, but to understand what we valued.